It's great to see such a big audience here, so thanks all for coming. Yeah, I'm Alan Mcclane. I was actually at the CHI conference in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago, which is, for those of you who don't know CHI, it's probably the biggest HCI research conference. And it was his first time in the UK in close to 40-year history. And I bumped into Elizabeth there, who I hadn't seen for quite a few years, and she happened to mention that she was going to be in the UK for a couple of weeks after the conference, so it just seemed too good a chance to miss. So she kindly agreed to come and talk to us all here in Cambridge. So thank you very much, Elizabeth. And let me just say a few words about Elizabeth's background before we pass her over. Elizabeth was one of our first sponsors PhD students at Xerox Europark in the late 80s. After a few years in academia in the UK, she moved to Silicon Valley in the 90s, where she's worked in increasingly senior roles in research for major players, including Fuji Xerox, Xerox PARC, Yahoo, eBay, and is now a UX director at Google. Alongside the day job, Elizabeth has also contributed significantly to the development of the usability-focused profession. She spent many years on the executive committee of SIGCHI, including 2 terms as vice president. Elizabeth was then elected to the council of the ACM, first as secretary and then last year as vice president. It's a testament, I think, to the progress achieved in positioning the human-centered approaches to technology design that the ACM, the world's largest educational and scientific computing society with about 100,000 members, now clearly recognizes the centrality of the human in the whole technical infrastructure. And Elizabeth has been a leading figure in helping to achieve this shift within the field as a whole. So Elizabeth is going to now tell us a little bit about how HCI has made that transition, with a bit of focus on some of the history of it, and then will tell us a bit more about Google's material design as a case study in this whole kind of area. So thank you, Elizabeth. Over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate you all coming out. Goodness, it's a lot of people. Thanks so much. I'm just recovering from a cold and a cough, so if I sound a little bit hoarser than normal, and if I cough a bit, please forgive me. My background in HCI started, I guess, in Sussex, and then I came and did my PhD here in Cambridge, mumble years ago. And so it's really, really lovely to be here and see so many people interested in tech and human-centered tech in this place that I consider to be very much a home for me. So thanks for coming out. And I'm going to just, that's all right, that's music to our ears. I want this to be a little bit informal. I'm just going to share some thoughts and perspectives and tell you a little bit about what my group does in particular, which is research. And I just wanted to start off with this, which was actually created by one of the people in my team a while back. And this was a sort of reflection on how a lot of folks who are developing technologies tend to get somewhat focused on their own products. So you sort of look at yourself, and then you look at your product, because you're doing that every single day, and then you're sort of looking at users, or the people who you hope will use your product. And so we do usability studies, we do lab studies, we do observations, we do field studies, but often it's through the lens of the product. And a lot of my career has been about trying to understand people first, and trying to understand not just what technical problem we're solving and what's cool, but also why people might want that. And then you sort of think about people in their context, in their perspective, using perhaps ethnographic techniques, field studies, and so forth. And then you think about where that product that you're building sits in their lives. So that kind of ideal it's great, but it's often hard to achieve. And often when we are stuck very, very much focused on the product, we do end up losing sight of the users and what they might want. That's beyond how we think about the technology and their use of the technology. And often, even when you've got a product, people will do a lot of analyses from behavioral log studies and so forth, which is great, but that just tells you what people are doing with your product. It doesn't tell you where that product weaves into their lives and where it sits in their lives and what meaning it has for them. So always trying to keep that bigger picture, I think, is really important. And this is particularly the case when you have all of these different form factors, and these are just the screen-based form factors that we're all very familiar with. But now we've got more and more of these devices in our homes, which may not have screens, We've got, the Google Home and variants of that. We've got maybe giant screens, which are off some of the time, which are reactive to us. So the world is changing. But this is very much the world that most of us are working in. And as of Q1 this year, 2019, Android has 2.1 million apps, 1.8 million apps, I think, in the Apple Store. So there's a lot of apps out there. A lot of people are online. Most people are online with one of these devices, and they're having these experiences with our kinds of software through these devices. So how do you start to codify, though, that human experience and bring that human experience to people who might not have expertise around human-centered design? They might not be like me with an undergraduate in psychology and years of cognitive science and then years of training and a PhD in cognitive science and HCI. So there's a lot of knowledge that you could potentially get, but you don't want to do all of those degrees yourself. So how does that knowledge get transformed, shared, expressed? Is this making funny noises? Yeah. It is making funny noises. Down? Okay. We will see how we go. So this is one way. One way is to give teams of developers and designers and experts of all kinds different kinds of guidelines, and Google's Product Excellence is one such set of guidelines. Now, if I look at something like this, focused utility, simple design, and crafted execution, because I have a background in experimental human-computer interaction, cognitive science, and programmable user models, when I take any one of these words, I can break those words down into what I think they operationalize as. But they tend to be super high level for most people who don't have that HCI background. So for me, this is a sort of distillation of a lot of knowledge that I can go and unpack what these things might mean. But when we do interviews, and my team does interviews with designers and developers, we get a very different picture. So what looks like a guideline for me that I can unpack and operationalize because of my background in HCI often will lead people to say, there's no guidance for this, I don't really understand how to apply this. There's no code for this. What do you mean this is what crafted execution looks like? What do you mean robust? And oh, the user testing that we did in our lab really quickly shows it's not going to work. Whatever you thought, robust means, our operational version of that doesn't work. It's not working for them, the users, either. So whatever we thought those words meant, although they're good guidelines and good ways of framing the world, we're not seeing that. And it's not that the guidelines aren't great, they are, but it's often in the everyday context. If you don't have that deep background, it's very hard to understand how they really apply and what to look for when you're doing usability studies or whatever, to see if you're even tracking in the right direction. So what do the developers and designers that we've talked to do? Well, typically, they go to their favorite search engine, and they look for people who have knowledge to share, and they look at different perspectives, they look at different people's observations. There are 1,000 blogs out there which are really about, trying to get great user experience. They look at case studies of products that might be somewhat similar to theirs. They look at principles and guidelines that maybe are a little bit more fleshed out than the ones that I just showed you. They look at heuristics for how other people might have solved these sorts of problems and operationalized something like robust. And they look at standards. And here's a good example. This is a standard for contrast ratio for text and images of text and background behind the text. I put that one up because this is one of the experimental things we're working with right now for material design specifically. So people do tend to, when they have time, go and look for these kinds of guidelines. And at Google, for example, we have standards that no product can go out that don't fit the basic accessibility guidelines. And it's one of the gates that we have before products go out. There are also things like design patterns, and I love the history of design patterns. I see there's a couple of people in the audience here who I believe know quite a lot about design patterns. this is one of my favorites, the Newton Programmer's Guide. IBM had a great one out, I think like 70s or so forth. But what I loved about this set of guidelines for Newton, is that it actually had code as well as design guidelines. So as well as having high-level principles, there were example bits of code that you could especially, like take and grab and implement. So this idea that you can bring the design principles, the human-centric principles, and the code together has always been very much an exciting thing in my mind. What am I doing with this thingy? I'm going to keep going. So about 2014, I would say, and I'm willing to take input on that, the idea of a design system started to come about. So you've got design guidelines, you've got these human-centered principles, you've got these standards, and you've got what we know from design to be all of the elements of design: form and shape, line, texture, color, space, movement, and motion. But about 2014, the idea that these engineered code components would be available with the design guidelines started to become very, very popular and gain momentum. And I'll tell you the story of Material and some of the history behind that, because Material was one of the said design systems that really kind of kicked all of this off. And Research, which is the group that I run, Material Design originally had some ad hoc research and some good research, but since I've been at Google, I started the team about 3.5 years ago, I've been building the research team that looks at the design components and looks at the designer and developer experience, like the examples of feedback that we got from doing field studies, going into agencies, working with Google designers and developers, and looking to see how individual designers and developers were taking up the design system. So the research team, I'm going to show you a little bit more about what we do and why I think that doing this kind of research behind the design system is really important for its generation going forward. So the research looks at what is needed in terms of components. It looks like, what should we create? And if we are going to create for the design system different components, how should we prioritize those? What works for people and who cares? What is the diffusion of the system and the components and its uptake? And most importantly, because material design is not only internal to Google, it's also open source. And so it's out there in the world, and it's an influence and a philosophy as well as a particular engineered design system. What's its inspiration and expansion for other people? So if I come to material design very specifically, there's a sort of joke that there's 100,000 plus users, designers and developers and contributors, and many of the apps that are using material have 1 billion plus users. So this is not just Google's design system, this is a system that is influencing a lot in the world, and it is not, like, as I say, it's open source. It is not finished. It is a work in progress. It is clay with which you can sculpt. So material.io will take you to our site. And so a little bit of the background to material as a design system. So it is a philosophy. It's a metaphor and guidelines and specifications and components. And it's visual interface, interaction design, and motion design. And this idea is that it's meant to be a single underlying system that allows for unified experiences across platforms and device sizes. Was the original incept for it, if you like. So the story goes that Larry Page, before my time, I was not working on this, said, why do we have so many products and everything looks different? Try and make something that comes together with a philosophy, and actually we can have some consistent design experiences, consistent interaction experiences that people really value, that are that robust and beautiful, and that fit together. So this was a direct request, and a bunch of very smart people got together, and I'll show you some of their early prototypes. But this is, it's things like buttons and fields and bars and so forth. It's the usual things that you're all used to using. And here's some of the lists. Google Fonts is part of the material family, so typography, very, very important to us, and we're actually expanding in that area, and I just hired a very senior researcher to help me build out all of the research around fonts as well, including looking at things like what kind of personality does a font have, and what font works well in a enterprise situation or a banking situation versus a game situation. So there's some really nice work which is around, sort of affect and emotion and the inspiration that even a font will give you. I love fonts, scrolling techniques, cards. I'm sure many of you will recognize these, and please, these have evolved over time, and not all of them are fully engineered, but a lot of them are. So Git, you can go and see some of the components in Git. This is actually a pretty old set of components, and I want to show you old and new so you can see that there's constantly this evolving. One of the things that came out at Google I/O recently, it was kicked off last year and has really kind of grown, is a thing called material theming. So one of the great things about being very successful with a design system is that everybody's stuff looks like yours. And that's not what we want, right? Because we want to have people be able to have their own brand expression. So material theming is material's attempt to allow you to take the design system and really push it in different directions. And part of the research of my research group is to go and see how people are pushing the design system, because we want to make sure that people can be creative, and are we giving people enough tools to be really, really creative? Because we want to make sure people can actually do what they need to do for their brand. So like I said, 2014, a bunch of very, very smart designers got together and started to think about what does a design system look like? What is our design system? And this word material, whenever I tell people I run research for material design as one of the products I run research for, they say, oh, you mean like hardware? And I'm like, no, not that kind of material, because material is the metaphor. But that begs an interesting question of how we might go to hardware, right? So here's like the metaphor. It's all about shadow and depth. And I think one of the earliest design systems that came out about 2011, 2012, I think it was called Metro, was much more about flat. It wasn't about depth. And material really wanted to use the human psychological system, the human visual system, to understand how depth invites different kinds of interactions. And this is the kind of stuff, back to my HCI early days, where we'd do experiments to have a look to see the perceptual and to see how depth puts things into perspective and gives you a sense of what's more important than something else for this action in this moment at this time. And so this idea of depth is very important. And here are some of the early shadow and perspective sketches. And a lot of this was also inspired because a number of the designers were very, sort of like deep design background, and the Bauhaus paper folding workshops were very much an inspiration of actually playing with material objects to think about how you would create something that implied depth and materiality. So a lot of things were created, and there was folding that was done, and these are the physical objects that were made, actual physical objects with lighting from all different sides, and captured, and then rendered, as I say, like in things like this. So how do you imply something that's really stepping out and invites you to take an action? And here's one of the paper prototypes that you might start to recognize. And you might recognize that one. So this idea of taking the physical and using the sort of human characteristics of the perceptual in order to invite tasks has always been very deeply embedded within the system, which makes my HCI heart happy. So here you can start to see some of the sketches, what steps out and what doesn't in a different layout. And then you can start to see this layering. And a lot of these are early sketches that were made that I'm showing you, because I wanted to give you a little bit of the history of some of the early stuff. And here's the color and the surface and the iconography, which emphasize different kinds of actions. So you've got the sort of background, and you've got the thing that pops out. again, a lot of playing with this, and there was a lot of experimentation to see what would and wouldn't work, not just with sketches, but also with different devices, and looking at things like, how does it feel? So here's some elevation work. Again, I wanted to show you some of the early sketches, so you can see how it's continued through, because I think part of being a system is to be systematic about what is the foundation and what gets to change. I just talked about theming being a change because we wanted to have the same foundation but allow the layers of the branding to be able to be different for different people's brands. And you'll start to recognize something like this, where the floating action button sort of sits above. And I think this starts to become familiar as well. So when you look at maps, start to think about what is the established layer, what sits on top of it that can change, what sits on top of that that can change, and where does the action button float so that you know that's the thing that I use. And again, all of this is really trying to kind of work with the human system of expectation. And not just, and you learn. So the thing about being systematic with a design system is that something that works in one context should work in another. And I'm going to give you some examples of where that may or may not break down. So this animation, so there was a lot of playing around with that animation pop. And, should it be alarming or should it be gentle? Should it bounce or should it just swoop in? So there's a lot of, trying that out with people to see what's the affective, the emotional response that people have to this sort of motion, this moment. And then looking how these work across different form factors. And I think one of the interesting things that we're looking at right now, obviously, is these are the small screens in our hands. How does this work or not work when the screen is that big? How should it pop at you or not? Will it be alarming because, the amount of the visual field it takes up might be super alarming, right, or not? So those are the real kind of psychological factors of what is the experience we're trying to create. So there we are. And I was, this last weekend when I was in London, coughing and spluttering and trying not to give anybody my cold, I took myself to the Charles Dickens Museum, which was really fun. Stayed away from all my friends who I liked, so I didn't give them any diseases. But I found this brilliant thing. It's a sticker for my fridge, right? It's a magnet. Take nothing on its looks, take everything on evidence. There's no better rule, from Great Expectations from Dickens. And because I work with very, very, very great visual designers, there's often this thing which is, oh, Elizabeth, you just want evidence about stuff, and it's hardcore experimental evidence. It's not the sensibility of the feeling. And a lot of our work has been breaking down that assumption that experiments and experience are at odds, that numbers can't tell you about deep experience, or that numbers can tell you everything. And so this idea of evidence is really important in my group and in material, which is what works for whom and when and why. And do we have to go back to that underlying understanding, sort of the human perceptual system and human interaction system and human cognitive system and human social system, is to actually understand what is the right evidence to understand whether this thing is likely to work or not. So we spend a lot of time working with designers, and I'm going to give you a couple of real concrete examples of how we do that with the design and engineering team in research. So we have three main areas of research in the team for material. The first is on the components themselves, and I'm going to give you an example of how we've done an experiment and how we've got subjective and objective measures of the usability and desirability of a particular kind of or set of text fields. And it's very granular, but really important, and I'll give you some stories about why. Then we have a bunch of products. So material, also under material comes gallery. Gallery is a tool that you can use to prototype, and we look at the usability of gallery. We also do a lot of studies on the material.io site that I showed you the screenshot from earlier. And we've been doing things like card sorts, which you'll be familiar with, and the architecture of the site to say, is it usable and for whom? We also have been studying designers and developers and people who are hybrids, who do a bit of design and a bit of development, to say, what is your navigation through our site? And how does this actually as a platform work for you? And then there's the workflow stuff beyond any of our products. Like I said, we went out and talked to folks in agencies, independent workers, folks in designers and developers, folks in Google Teams. We've gone and talked to them and observed them and said, how do you do your work? What are the tools that you use now? What does not work for you? What does work for you? Where are your giant pain points? And I'll show you some results from some of that. So I mentioned earlier the sort of ethnographic. This is much more like a real in situ, messy world of the everyday, going and studying and observing people and doing diary studies. The team just finished a pretty extensive diary study with many designers and developers worldwide, and these folks spent like 6 weeks giving us a lot of data and talking to us. So anyway, so these are the different kinds of research that we do. And I'm going to step back right now and give you one example of a component research project. And this was conducted by Michael Gilbert, who's a brilliant researcher, and Dave Chu, who's a great interaction designer, and Samir Bansal, who's a great visual designer. And the three of them came together to look to understand what an input text box could be like. So what they did was work with researchers, work with people, look back at the literature, the HCI literature, and said, what are the kinds of things that from a human point of view we need to understand should be available for this text box? So people should be able to know that that's a text field. They should be able to comprehend text fields in a very complex compositional form. They should be able to locate a particular text field. So you can see we're going from the granular component to in context of task. Do they understand all of the things around the text field? Is it legible or readable to them as what kind of text field it is? And can it, in the context of a task, get done what you need to be doing really, really quickly? So what they did was come up with all of these different, there was a huge amount of work that went into what are the things that you could vary. And the designers who had been very well trained said, here are the parameters, here are the things that we push. Here are the decisions that we're making. So if you like, what we were trying to do with the designers was say, be explicit about what are the decisions that you're making and why you're making them, and let's figure out what are the key elements that go behind some of those experiential aspects that we have laid out. So you've got input color adjustments, and there's a lot of things. And Michael created this with the help of a couple of folks. And this is our random form generator with the things, the draw type, label location, label contrast, background color, signifier contrast, signifier style. And then you can play around as the experimenter and come up with all of the various conditions that you want to give your experimental participants at scale. So we use Mechanical Turk, and we invite lots and lots and lots of people. We had 144 conditions. We had a lot of different activities. We measured where people, we were using Qualtrics as well, where people clicked. We looked how long it took them to scroll through a form for a particular task. We looked at how efficient and effective they were. And then we asked them later, what did you like and what did you not like? And it turns out that some of these forms look really ugly. I'm sure nobody in this room would design these, but they were kind of important for us to push the different dimensions that we were interested in looking at. And then we ended up with something that looked like this. So that's just one of the data analyses that they did. They actually printed this out. So we printed it out, plotted it on this huge long thing and put it up against the wall. And all you need to know from this is that anything on this side ends up performing better by those criteria that we laid out than anything on this side. And as per great research design collaboration, we didn't say as researchers, you have to do this. What we said are, here are the things that we all agreed upon from understanding people and the perceptual and the legibility. here are all of the factors that we agreed upon, and these ones perform better than those ones. So you can make your choice if you want to be down at that end, but these are the ones that from a human-centered point of view. And so this is a very, very classic, but at scale kind of experiment that I learned back in the day in my HCI training. But now we've got these tools. You can do it at scale, and you can do it really quickly, and you can iterate and do the tests again and again and again. So we ended up with, I showed you this earlier. This was one of the text fields that actually did work really well. And if you go to the spec, material.io site and the spec, you'll see the recommendation, and you'll start to see variations on that, which have been, as I say, just a little bit varied, which are appearing through in our products at Google, but also as our recommendations. So there you see how research at a very granular level can start to unpack what works for somebody or not, or people or not, at scale. And one of the interesting things about doing this was the accessibility group at Google is very active, obviously, and very importantly, they came to us when they saw the results for this and said, we've been looking for data to demonstrate that the things on this side are more accessible, in fact, than on that side, because it follows our intuition and our lab studies where we only had a few participants, but given that you've done it at scale, we have some real evidence that we were onto the right track. And since this study was done, this was done actually a couple of years ago, about 18 months, 2 years ago, but I like it as an example because it led to a really deep collaboration between my team and the accessibility group at Google. And in fact, Michael, who really drove a bunch of this work, is now on accessibility, on one of the accessibility guidelines committees. And he's going then actually representing a lot of material design and other design work. Because I really want us to be part of that bigger picture of sharing the results. The other thing that we've been promising to do, but I haven't got around to yet, is to write up all of the experimental methods, because one of the things we want to do is for you to be able to go home and say, in our context with material theming, or whatever your design system might be, that would be a great thing for us to, experimental technique to use, great thing for us to do, and then maybe we can share some content back with you about why this works better or worse or in our context. So that's just one example. I'm now going to talk about something a little bit more complicated, so the context and components. So this is some work that we're really sort of kicking off right now, because a lot of material design emerged for what I would call sort of consumer and discretionary applications. And one of the things that we're really interested in is how does that generalize to other contexts? One such context might be international, and we've started kicking some work off there. Another context is actually a different work context. So, for example, enterprise solutions. And one of the things that we have been noticing a lot is information density is a really important issue. So if you're a discretionary user, a casual user of an app, it might not be quite so important to you to have information densely represented than if you're an expert who knows where to look and you want that content in context of the problem-solving tasks that you have. So we're starting to push and have a look at some of that. And again, this is led by Michael. Michael is the lead researcher for material system research. He's based out of New York. And so he's been looking at information density, and you can see a low information density page from Harry Potter there. And this is James Joyce's Dubliners. And, arguably, it's not just the information density of the words, but also the words themselves. But I'm not going to even go into that bit for now, because this is pretty deep. A bit deep for me right now. But you can start to see how information density, once you take out all of the characteristics, you've still got different kinds of density going on here. And so I'm just going to show you this very quickly. But here are some of the animations that the team made for us to start playing with, sort of density within a container, density across different components and containers, density across a page, and how that might change. So we've started to do that same sort of thing, of push the boundaries and then start to build the experiments. And much of this it's work in progress. It's been done currently mostly in lab studies, but we'll do something a bit bigger soon. And first results, increase the inner and outer, but keep the information consistent. But we've been starting to do that breakdown, like I did with scannability and findability and all that, with what is the user intent. So, if you are an expert looking for a particular piece of information and you need that information to be in context and you need to go and find it, or are you doing something where you're a discretionary user, even in an enterprise context, going through the complexity of the content and your expertise? Very important. The interaction complexity. What do you need to do with this information? Do you need to copy and paste it? Do you need to act on it in some way? And of course, the architecture of where, if you do act on something, where do you need to go next? So we've started to try and build that out a little bit. And the trick with this, as I think everyone in this room knows, is to keep this to the point where, going back to that guidelines for designers and developers who feel they don't want to do a full-fledged PhD in HCI or whatever it might be, is to come up with something with a rationale for why you've argued that and make it simple enough to be applied, but where the complexity of where it may not apply, or how to ask the question about what would you see if this was not working for you. So just a different kind of literacy around breaking this sort of problem down. And that's what we're sort of working on. So I'm going up through the components, the contexts and combinations to the production process, which was what I was saying, I've been referring to as more of that kind of ethnographic, observational. And we really have been doing a lot of work with designers and developers in-house and out to say, what does your work look like? How do these tools fit in with other tools? What are the pressures upon you? What do you have to produce? And we all, I think in this room, know that there's a sort of air gap often between design and development. And even if you really are a hybrid who can do a bit of both, the tools don't necessarily well support some of that activity. And so here's a classic workflow. This was Sarah Cambridge did this work. And she said, and this work has been replicated. She did this work a couple of years ago. And I've got there's a woman on my team, Clara Clemens Silva and Abla Hamilton, 2 women on my team. They've been doing the same studies again and interviewing. And we have similar, I just want to see if anyone recognizes this. You get a brief and you're really excited. Excited? Yeah? Little overwhelmed by scope. Anyone in this room ever been overwhelmed by scope? Yeah. Anyone in this room, like, technical constraints? No! And then you talk to the engine team and they're like, yes! And then you get the concept buy-in to maybe rescope, you get your design approved, and then you're starting to track the design feedback. So you've got the feedback on here, and then you get a little bit more excitement because you're working as a designer really well with developers. The developers are really excited because there's a new animation technique or whatever that they can apply here to solve the problem. And then the researchers come in. What we're trying to do is have our researchers come in much earlier with these design guidelines, questions, and to inform a bunch of those conversations. You know, Wizard of Oz, quick and dirty prototypes. Have that design knowledge be part of the conversations around here through these codified principles, even if there's no engineered component. Design specs, handoff, issues uncovered by, our development team launch. So this is very classic. And what, my passion is, and the team passion is to make those guidelines and make those methods for doing early prototype testing before you've invested a lot of time and energy right up front, so that everyone in the room feels that they can own a little bit of or have some literacy with what research may show or is likely to show. So one of the things we do in the team is we have a really good archive of very tactical research that we review fairly regularly to say what's programmatic about this and where are the pieces that keep coming up time and time again. We also do a lot of readouts and collaboration with folks. And in fact, at Google I/O this year, which was just happened, a number of the team were out talking to folks who had come to I/O and doing reviews of early prototypes of apps that folks had brought in, and saying things like, yeah, we tried that before, we've seen that, oh, that's an interesting question, we could go and have a look at, and really doing a deep dive on what might work or might not work. So the other odd thing, it's not odd, but the other thing we found, this is work by Elisa Weinstein, and she, again on my team, I asked her to go and interview folks to find out how a design system might work in their daily life. So you've got the components, you've got, what is it doing for you? Why would you use a design system, whichever one it might be? And this is again, I don't want you to read all of this, but what I want you to see is that there are two things that I anticipated seeing. That there would be speed, efficiency, and clarity of process, and that the consistency, usability, and utility of the product might be better, which was Larry's first request back in 2014, right? The other things that came out that I had not anticipated, but there was an aha moment, was when we talked to managers, the team health was much better. So managers were telling us that there was much less churn and burnout because people didn't have to start every problem from scratch every single time. And that the design system itself actually brought a kind of consistency of way of thinking about the problem, even if the design system didn't give the specific component. It gave a scaffold for a conversation. The other thing was job satisfaction. So we heard from a number of designers and developers saying that there was less friction, as I say, less replicated work, and like classic psychology, people were collaborating over the design system rather than trying to unpack their different language for the same thing between design and development. So there's some really interesting, there's a great sociological concept called a ticket to talk. And there's also a thing like, the conversation focus. So people were talking to each other more because working with the design system gave them an opportunity to interrogate the problem space in a different way and to focus on that, not on whether the communication was bad between them. So it took the problem space out of the social and into the collaborative, which I think is really interesting. And again, from my HCI background, there was the aha moment when I was like, that makes perfect sense. Why didn't I think of it? So we've started to look at these different metrics. One person actually said that they got reduced stress and more hours of sleep. And promotion rates and performance rates, because there's also a language around, what you're doing effectively and so forth. So for me, this is expected, and for me, this stuff down here is really interesting, and I've just put some things in red, because I think there's been this giant call in our industry for digital well-being for consumers, and one of my passions is digital well-being for designers and developers. So how can you create work context with the right tools that allow those collaborative relationships to flourish effectively and to do problem solving in a very focused way without it necessarily causing too much friction between very complex domains of design and development, and then building something that's got all of that crafted execution that we started with the principles from Google. So I'm very, very excited about this work. So if I was to sort of sum up a little bit here, these are the design system ideas that, research and design and engineering and in our team. So the material design team now has, I would say, about 70 or so engineers, 50 or so designers, and the research team is growing and growing, about 20 at the moment, and focused specifically on this, about 12. And I think of design systems not as a thing you have to do, but they're generative frameworks for thinking and predicting what might happen. And so, I was saying I'm home. I mean, my PhD was in programmable user models, which was about how do you generate a user model that you can then make predictions about human behavior given different contexts. So I feel like I've come home, really. And, really this deep integration and conversations around codified research early. And they're always evolving. And the idea is to inspire others to generate new systems and systems of systems. And, it might be that the work context that you're in, what material provides is not the right flavor, the right metaphor, the right shape, whatever. But the ideas of this abstraction of the ways that these different, the components sit together in contexts and how they help the people who actually are doing the production work, I think probably are in common between different design systems. So I'm really excited to kind of think about these as it shifts from here to here through the rich knowledge that you can then interrogate and use to talk to others who might have more expertise in the user-centric. And finally, material is a community. And so every year there are the material awards. And I've been lucky enough to be on a couple of the evaluations for these. And so people submit different apps that they've built using material. They give us feedback on what worked and what didn't, and there's a bunch of awards, and there's a bunch of people come together and say, I think this should go a different way. This is great. This really works for me. So that kind of feedback is very important to us. And as I said, one of the things that we're building out in my team right now is much more of this community evaluation, having a look to see what's happening in the community, what's working for people, what's not, and learning to see what other kinds of design systems there are that we could learn from, and then just move the whole field forward together. So with that, I want to say thank you very, very much. Really appreciate the time and attention and you coming out on this afternoon. So thanks.